And we will begin with Mr. Robertson for your testimony. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I am Doug Robertson. I'm Chairman of the Board of Commissioners in Douglas County, Oregon, and also President of the Association of O&C Counties. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and testify on the O&C Trust Conservation and Jobs Act, sponsored by Congressman DeFazio, Schrader, and Walden. The O&C Trust Conservation Job Act is an attempt to solve a 20-plus year jobs, forest health, and county funding quagmire. The Oregon-California Railroad grant lands have played a unique and critical role in the fabric of Western Oregon communities. The O&C lands only exist in the state of Oregon and were at one point all in private ownership. This land base grows approximately 1.5 billion board feet of timber every year and used to have a harvest level of roughly 1.1 billion board feet. Half of the revenue generated from the sale of this timber goes to the O&C County's general fund, unlike Forest Service revenues, which receipts are shared at 25% and are dedicated to schools and roads. Unlike the laws governing other federal forest lands, the 1937 O&C Act is a dominant use statute which places management jurisdiction of these lands under the United States Department of Interior. These lands are not national forests and are not managed under the principle of multiple use. These lands are managed by the Bureau of Land Management under a dominant use statute, and that dominant use is timber production within the principle of sustained yield for the benefit of the counties in which they're located. Due to the listing of the spotted owl and the adoption of the Northwest Forest Plan, timber harvests from these lands have been reduced by more than 80%. Today, the BLM is incapable of coming up with a workable management plan or path forward to meet the stated goals of the O&C Act. Much like other projects on federal lands, O&C timber sales are continuously protested, appealed, and litigated, and this uncertainty is crushing rural Oregon counties, communities, and economies. The O&C Trust Conservation and Jobs Act places the surface estate of roughly 1.4 million acres of O&C land into a trust to be managed by a board of trustees under state and federal laws that currently apply to private and state lands in Oregon. This trust concept works very well in the chairman's own state of Washington, where the Washington Department of Natural Resources produces roughly $125 million annually for the benefit of their communities. This is all accomplished while protecting fish, wildlife, and water resources, as would be the case under the O&C Trust Conservation and Jobs Act. This bipartisan proposal is a unique approach to solve the management issues on a very unique landscape and was initiated out of the desired need to find balance and to provide something of substance for all interested parties while continuing to observe the principles contained in the 1937 O&C Act. We recognize it's no longer 1937, and we don't expect to return to harvest levels of 1,100,000,000 feet per year. But we also recognize the Act's sustained yield management principles are as relevant today as they were then. Our goal has been to blend those principles with the changing attitudes of today into a management regimen that provides the balance the public is seeking. This balance includes designating areas for active timber management and other areas for conservation purposes. Finally, Mr. Chairman, let me just say this. I've been an elected county commissioner in Douglas County for over 32 years. Many of those years have been spent working on this issue. I have never seen the discussion of federal forest management with its emotion and suggested solutions and concern elevated to this level before. Clearly, fire, insect infestation, disease, the declining health of our federal forests, and long-term funding of our county governments have struck a note with you and many of your colleagues. Having said that, it is absolutely imperative that federal forest management legislation be passed by the House of Representatives and moved to the Senate. For if it is not, the discussion of improving management on our federal forest lands will end here. And that's something we cannot and must not allow to happen. Finally, A wise man faced with similar problems as we face today once said, we can no longer afford to sacrifice the good in pursuit of the perfect. There is no perfect solution to this. We all wish there was, but there isn't. But there are good solutions, and this is one of them. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Good testimony. Thank you, Mr. Robertson. Appreciate that. Now proceed to Mr. Tuchman for your testimony, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Tom Tuchman, and I serve as Governor John Kitzhaber's Forestry and Conservation Finance Advisor. The Governor thanks you very much for the invitation to participate today. As I think you know, he's unable to do so as the Oregon Legislature is in session. The Governor would also like to recognize the Congressman Peter DeFazio, Congressman Walden, and Congressman Schrader for their strong leadership on this very, very difficult issue. Oregonians, indeed all Americans, feel very strongly about their public lands, and it takes real courage to step forward and propose changes that are reflected in the Oregon Trust, ONC Trust Conservation and Jobs Act, and your leadership is greatly appreciated back home. Mr. Chairman, the Governor holds very strong conservation values and believes public lands can and should be managed to provide clean water, threatened and endangered species habitat, recreational values, and a diversity of forest types and ages. Yet he also believes a proportion of these lands can simultaneously provide some sustainable level of timber to support local communities and regional economies. Some say these are mutually incompatible goals, but given our large, resource-rich public land system, the Governor respectfully disagrees. Commissioner Robertson went into detail on the background of the ONC Act, and I would like to really cut to the chase here and say that the Governor feels that the pendulum has swung from harvest levels in the 1980s that largely did not sustain a wide array of conservation attributes to current practices that forecasts only 15 to 25-year window of thinning sales that are left. Timber volume produced from thinnings is good. It provides valuable resource to mills, but does not provide adequate quantity and quality of logs to local mills, nor do they produce adequate funds for basic public services in the 18 ONC counties that Commissioner Robertson referenced. The Northwest Forest Plan is working with regard to conservation objectives, but it's not working with regard to its timber objectives. While increased federal timber harvest will not solve all of Oregon's economic challenges, it can and should serve as the foundation for doing so. So where do we go from here? While the Governor would like to work with Congress to make changes that incorporate broader conservation protections, he appreciates that the ONC discussion draft provides predictability for local timber industry, county governments, and for old growth protection. The Governor stands ready to do his part and has already been deeply involved in this issue. His written statement summarizes both a report based on the results of a panel convened. This panel included conservation, timber, and county representatives, and also his recommendations based on that report. The Governor encourages Congress to use elements of the ONC Act discussion draft, the panel report, and his recommendations to craft a bill that can be signed into law this session. He feels confident that if we think creatively and outside the box, as he says, that we can optimize what everybody wants from our ONC forests. Thank you again for this opportunity. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tuchman. And Mr. Kulikowski, did I get that right?
You did.
Great. If you'd like to give us your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Dominic Kulikowski. I have been researching insect outbreaks and fires in Rocky Mountain Forest for 15 years. I have authored numerous peer-reviewed scientific papers on these topics. During this time, I have worked as a research scientist at the University of Colorado, and I am now a professor at Clark University, where I continue this research. In recent decades, wildfires have burned millions of acres of forests, and insect outbreaks have killed trees over an even larger area. My research, as well as that of many other scientists, indicates that both of these disturbances are being driven by climate. A critical issue in this context is whether and to what degree outbreaks may heighten the risk of active crown fires, which are particularly dangerous due to their high intensity and rate of speed. The answer to this question is complex, but the bottom line is that any influence of outbreaks on fire risk is small compared to the overarching influence of weather, which is much more important. For example, my research group recently completed a study in which we examined the occurrence of severe wildfires in lodgepole pine forests in Colorado over the past century. we found no detectable increase in the occurrence of high-severity fires following mountain pine beetle outbreaks. Instead, we found that wildfires have overwhelmingly occurred in years of drought. We also found a similar overarching influence of drought on fires in spruce forests that had been affected by outbreaks. In sum, catastrophic fire is not an inevitable outcome of bark beetle outbreaks. Instead, climate exerts the dominant influence on fire risks in these forests. Given prolonged and recurring drought conditions, there is a need to protect homes and communities from wildfire. Previous research has shown that reducing flammable material in the immediate vicinity of structures and replacing flammable building materials such as wooden decks with non-flammable alternatives most effectively protects structures against fire. Our research has found that focusing fuel reduction treatments in the immediate vicinity of structures rather than in remote forests would not only be more effective at reducing fire risk to those structures, but would also involve treating less land and thus would lead to lower financial and ecological costs. Furthermore, much of the land that primarily determines flammability of homes is not in national forests, but rather is private land that is adjacent to homes and communities. It is on that private land that fire hazard mitigation is likely to be most effective for protecting structures. A larger context is that as a nation, we are increasingly building homes in fire-prone ecosystems. This type of development in the wildland-urban interface, especially when coupled with prolonged drought, is putting homes and lives at risk. Therefore, an important way of reducing this risk would be to reduce the number of structures that are being built in harm's way. In addition to protecting communities from wildfire, another important goal of forest management is promoting ecosystem resilience. Over the past century, forests of the Rocky Mountains have been resilient to both wildfires and bark beetle outbreaks. Currently, it is unknown whether forest resilience has been compromised by the magnitude and extent of these disturbances and by an unfavorable post-disturbance climate. Nevertheless, following even very severe bark beetle outbreaks, some trees and seedlings survive and viable seeds remain in the soil. Therefore, promoting ecosystem resilience should complement existing resilience and natural regeneration. Although ongoing outbreaks understandably have led to widespread public concern about increased fire risk, the effects of outbreaks are not as important as the controlling influence of weather and climate. During drought, the risk of fires is often high, and the most effective way of protecting homes from that risk is by treating land in their immediate vicinity. More broadly, any comprehensive forest management plan will eventually need to address housing development in the wildland-urban interface, as well as trends in climate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor, for your testimony, and we'll now move on to the questions. And I'll go ahead and start. And Doctor, I probably just have one question really for the panel. We've covered a lot of ground here today during the course of these hearings, but you, like previous panelists, seem to suggest that the beetle outbreaks do not contribute to the fire danger, but what about simple overstocking of the forests? We can't control the weather, and we certainly can, though, control the fuel that's going to be available to burn. Wouldn't it be prudent to undertake forest thinning to be able to reduce the intensity of the fires rather than just to sit back and blame change for the uncharacteristic fires that have resulted from forest overgrowth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in principle, that makes sense. But when we examine how fires have actually behaved in areas that have been thinned, we actually don't see any meaningful effect of those thinning treatments. So, for example, in the Hayman fire in Colorado, there were areas that had burned that were treated prior to that fire. And when researchers examined the behavior of the fire, they found actually no effect of those thinning treatments. Similarly, in northern Colorado, there was quite a large area that was treated after the windstorm that blew down forests in 1997. Again, when wildfires occurred in that area in 2002, our own research found that fires were just as extensive and just as severe in areas that had been treated versus areas that had not been treated. The reason, I would guess, is because timber harvesting by design is intended as an economic endeavor. The small branches, twigs, etc., are not as valuable as the larger stems. So the finer fuels are essentially left behind. During wildfire, it's those fine fuels that carry fires through treated forests.
You know, great point. It's always interesting on studies to where you can find to be able to support your position. One that you might want to actually take a look at, you've been in Colorado. It was a 2010 study of the tripod fire. It was published by the Forest Service and the Joint Fire Science Program, and it found that 57% of the trees survived in areas where recent mechanical thinning combined with prescribed burns that occurred, and only 14% of the trees survived in areas where no timber management had actually taken place. And so it's probably trying to find that actual good common sense balance to be able to get in and address these areas and to look for the win-win, to be able to turn some of these biofuels actually into usable electricity as well. So appreciate your comments. I'd now like to yield to Mr. DeFazio for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panel for sitting through a long day and traveling a long way to give their testimony. There are some policymakers, and I just already saw a quote in a story regarding today's hearing from the Pacific Rivers Council saying that, in fact, under status quo, we could produce more timber and more revenues for the counties. And I'd direct my question first to Mr. Tuckman. I believe the Governor's Task Force looked at this issue, and what conclusions did they come to regarding that?
Congressman DeFazio, thank you for the question. As I mentioned in our written testimony, we looked at 7 different runs, we call them, different options for managing these ONC forests. And Run A was the status quo. It was not how the Northwest Forest Plan was originally intended, but how it's currently being operated on the ground, and that's primarily through thinnings. And that produced about 185 million board feet for probably 15 to 25 years, depending on one's perspective, and I think around $13 million to counties. That's not Secure Rural Schools money. That's if it was just completely dependent on timber harvest and the revenues generated from that. And with that in mind, I mean, that is an area where the governor feels the status quo is not working, that the ONC Act and the Northwest Forest Plan need to be modernized in a way that increases federal timber supply, payments to counties, and also institutionalizes the conservation components of the plan as well.
Okay, thank you. Institutionalizes meaning permanent protections.
Yeah.
Okay. The riparian issue was discussed by the panel or the task force, as I understand it, and you know, there were some comments and concerns about the riparian provisions. Could you address that briefly?
Congressman, yes. You know, the aquatic conservation strategy in the Northwest Forest Plan is a success story. We have seen increases in water quality. The 1998 monitoring report has some statistics on that. And some of the concerns, I don't want to speak for the panel members, the concerns from the conservation panelists was that the current discussion draft does not include protections within the trust for riparian areas, and that was there was a robust discussion of that. The governor feels that that is an area that he would like to see improved and strengthened in any final resolution to this issue, and it's something that I think would be rationalized not just by the monitoring report, but also new science that shows that, well, let me back up, these buffers were interim buffers, and so there was the thought when the Northwest Forest Plan was passed that over time there would be more watershed analysis, and that based on the particular watershed there would be increased or decreased. That never happened. And there is some science that is evolving that says, hey, we should be doing that. You can reduce a portion of the buffers, not all of them, but a portion of them, 20 to 60%, I think, based on the watershed, and not have an effect on water quality.
And I believe you looked at an option that would incorporate some additional public domain lands which are interspersed.
That's right.
And apply then those buffers, and that did get both a higher water quality and higher harvest levels.
That's right.
That's correct. Mr. Robertson, do you have any comment on that issue, on the water issue, the riparian?
Congressman DeFazio, there's no question that water is a very serious topic for all Oregonians. And as Mr. Tuckman pointed out, it was a robust discussion within the panel. We feel there is an opportunity for movement to increase protection without having a negative impact on outputs on the land.
Okay, thank you. Quickly, and I will have a second round if I can, Mr. Chairman. Sure. This is very important to us. The discussion draft did not include the recent legislation was introduced by Senators Wyden and Merkley regarding settlement with 2 tribes that has never been brought to fruition. Do either of you have a comment on the inclusion of those in a final version of this bill?
Congressman DeFazio, Senator Wyden and Merkley have introduced a discussion draft, as you know, proposing something in the neighborhood of 32,000 acres divided between the 2 unlanded tribes left in the state of Oregon. Our concern initially was that if that land was going to come from the ONC land base, that there be something in the way of equal acres value or volume to replace it. In other words, a no net loss to the ONC land base. Through discussions subsequent to the release of the draft, Senator Wyden has agreed to that, and we're confident that there will be no negative impact on the ONC land base.
Okay, thank you. And the governor would favor inclusion?
Congressman, the governor would favor that as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will have another round. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Walden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate the great work that you're doing on these issues. Long ago and far away when this room was of a different color. I want to commend you, by the way, on what you've done with the room. It looks pretty nice. I served on this committee and know its importance to our state and our country. And I want to thank our witnesses today for your testimony and your collaboration and your help with us on this legislation. Mr. Robertson, Commissioner, you've certainly been on the forefront of this. I think it sort of sprung from an idea that you had many, many years ago, or the ONC counties did. Are you confident there's the right balance here between the lands going into trust and not going into trust in terms of the ability to actually produce the revenue and the jobs while operating under Oregon Forest Practices Act, which is, I think, a very responsible statute when it comes to stewardship of federal forests? Is this going to get the job done to give you the certainty, as you represent communities all over Oregon as our witness today, is this going to give you the certainty?
We feel if this proposal were adopted in its current form, it would do that. As you know, you and your staff, Congressman DeFazio and Schrader, have worked very hard with many others in trying to ensure that the outputs do meet the requirements both of the counties, providing a predictable supply of raw material for the industry, and ensuring the significant conservation gains. Understanding that all of those sectors had to be addressed, our feeling is, representing the Association of ONC Counties, that this would get us there. We feel confident it would.
And Mr. Tuckman, does the governor feel that way as well, that we've struck the right balance here, realizing I know you've got some suggestions here?
Congressman, this is an area that the governor would like to work with you more on. Over 50% of the land base. There are no numbers in the bill, as you know. Some models that we've seen and projected are that over 50% of the land base would be put in this type of management. It's an issue that causes great concern to a number of Oregons and Oregonians, and we'd like to work with you on that.
I appreciate that. Obviously, I assume the governor supports the Forest Practices Act, and the state of Oregon is a responsible management tool for our federal forests, or our state and county and local forests, private forests, right?
Yeah, yes, it
and
does.
You feel, I mean, because that's kind of why we went there as the overriding management tool, because I feel that. I mean, I think it's a responsible way to manage. I'm a lifelong native-born Oregonian, and so I think we have to keep in mind that part of the trade-offs here is that there's a chunk of ONC land that then would not be necessarily active managed, and this would be. And what I want to guard against, because I've seen it happen over time, is the lands we set aside for active management then get a whole new layer of restrictions, and eventually you haven't accomplished a thing. And that's why there are some interesting handcuffs and release points in here, that if this is thrown out, then the O&C Act comes back, and the wilderness comes back out, and all of those. Are you all comfortable with those provisions, the sort of handshake provisions?
Congressman, the governor came out with a report that has seven different options. He thinks that some combination of a trust, a land sale, or a dominant use would provide a solution that would be acceptable to all parties. He has not specified what he thinks that right mix is. I mean, frankly, the view is that the foundation we set with our panel in Oregon should also be brought to Washington, and we should finish the job here.
Well, and that's obviously what my colleague from Lane County and I have tried to do with our colleague from Clackamas County over the years, is come to something we think can move here in this environment. And so we've made a lot of trade-offs to get to this point, and we'll continue to work that. As Peter said this morning, there are things in here he doesn't like, things in here I don't like, and I can tell you some of my constituents don't like, and some of his don't like. So I'm just sort of laying out there, I don't know how much more wiggle room there is, but obviously we're open, and as we have been in the meetings in Portland we had with you and the governor and others, you know, we're willing to continue the discussion, but I would just caution that this is about trying to get certainty for jobs, certainty for management, certainty for revenues before these counties go broke. And I'm committed to continuing in that effort, as I have in the past on legislation like Healthy Forest Restoration and others that became law, that we just got to get this done. So I appreciate the governor's leadership on it. I know he's taken some knocks as well. And Commissioner, thank you for your leadership, and my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. And we'll go to a second round. Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in following up on that, you mentioned the new science. Ms. Tuckman, as I understand, you're probably referring to Gordy Reeves' work at OSU, which has looked at the Northwest Forest Plan, where the interim standards were 2 mature tree lengths in all areas, and has concluded that in many areas that could be reduced to 1, not necessarily all areas, but depending on the sensitivity of the slopes, the soils, et cetera, et cetera. Is that what you're referring to there? That is what I'm referring to, and I think it's important to clarify that, as we've heard in panels past, this is not a one-size-fits-all solution. What I think Dr. Reeves and his colleagues would recommend is that we need to go in on a watershed-by-watershed basis, and based on that watershed and what that analysis provides, you can, on those riparian areas, make that reduction on, the number I've heard is 20 to 50, 60%. But at some riparian areas it may be 0, and some riparians it might be 80%. It depends on the particular condition of that watershed. One idea which has been put forward would be the idea to use potentially some of the revenues to work with willing private property owners in critical areas and enhance riparian buffers in those areas. And I mean, are the commissioners, I mean, since that would be coming out of some of your potential revenue, have the commissioners taken a position on that, Mr. Robertson?
We support that. The reality is that the physical nature of these lands are in a checkerboard. You have industrial owners contiguous to BLM, contiguous to industrial owners, and so on. It's very difficult to manage a watershed in that regard. So the possibility of using some of the resources that come from management of the lands to address this issue, working with private landowners, willing private landowners, is something under consideration.
Okay, thank you. And I assume the governor would be supportive of that?
Not only supportive, strongly supportive, and would also like to participate both through the state's agencies and financially in contributing that to as well. We want to be part of the solution.
That'd be great. Now, as Greg mentioned, there are parts that cause us each some heartburn, and one area would be the wilderness protection for the Rogue in particular. And, you know, I know, Commissioner Robinson, you're perhaps not a tremendous fan of wilderness designations, not saying that you're against them, but have the ONC counties, you know, evaluated this package as a whole, looking at the inclusion of the wilderness?
That's been a difficult area for us, as you pointed out. However, understanding the discussions that have gone on for many years, the identification of sensitive areas surrounded by ONC lands, and the opportunity to reach an agreement and move forward in terms of management and recognizing and protecting some of these special areas. Our board has accepted that and is prepared to move forward. So it's a tough discussion, as you know. We've been involved in it for many, many years. It seems that at a time when counties are struggling, industry struggling, forest health is declining, that simply putting more land in a reserve status not to be managed perhaps is not the right decision to make. However, understanding also the dynamics that we're dealing with and our commitment to address the issues of all stakeholders, we're prepared to move forward with the provisions that are in the Act.
Okay. Ms. Tuckman, is the inclusion of those provisions important to the governor from his?
They are.
And to the task force?
They were, yes, they were.
And didn't, I believe that the industry, I mean, I guess we could, I don't know what's confident, but I have not heard that the industry objected to those provisions.
Well, let me clarify. The report that was drafted was a staff report that my colleague and I drafted, and the panel members did not take a position on the particular components. They did release a statement. Each individual panelist has their own position on a wide array of these issues.
Okay.
As far as the governor, his position is that he thinks additional protections for special places, as outlined in our testimony, in his testimony, should be included in any final bill.
Okay, thank you. And just, if I could, the indulgence of the chairman, just one question for Dr. Kulikowski, and I appreciate his contributing to the debate. You know, we have some communities that have adopted, well, it's actually required in some areas, like where I have a cabin in Central Oregon, what are called Firewise steps. Have you seen, you know, significant differences in terms of destruction of property and or those areas which have taken these preventative steps?
I have, and everything I've seen indicates that these Firewise practices, which involve treating the land in the immediate vicinity of homes and communities, is the best way to go if our goal is to protect those homes and communities.
So this would be sort of along the lines of the original provisions of HIFRA, where we were going to start in what was called the WUIs and kind of work our way out from there and emphasize the area within the WUIs to protect communities and individual properties.
Exactly. Everything I've seen indicates that if we want to prioritize protecting homes from wildfires, we should start in the wildland-urban interface and start by creating defensible space in the immediate vicinity of structures.
And so your concerns that you expressed about, you know, using harvest as a mechanism which you consider a bit unsettled to deal with fire and intensity, but at least in this limited instance, you would support that because that's what this does involve, is getting a certain setback. And
right. I didn't intend to express an opinion against harvest. Instead, I'm thinking about what are our real goals. If our goals are to harvest forests, we should do that. If our goals are to protect homes and communities from wildfires, we should do that. And if we're talking about the latter case, it makes the most sense to begin in the wildland-urban interface and by creating defensible space.
okay, thank you. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fazio. And are there any other questions? With none, certainly want to thank you. You're the most hardy of all. You